Hello and welcome to the Situation Report today. Very glad to have you joining me. This is the show where we do our best to provide the information and perspectives you need to navigate an ever-changing culture. My name is Jeremy Stolniker. I am your host. And today we have a great guest having a great conversation about a documentary that he made. And I'll talk about him in just a second. But when we talk on this show about information and perspectives, my hope is not to simply provide the information and perspectives needed in this moment right now to navigate an ever-changing culture, to navigate culture as it changes right now. Really, I would love for this to be a show and for the archive of episodes that we have to be something that folks in the future down the road could go back to and learn from, that the principles that are taught, the conversations that are had, they're timeless as much as we can produce timeless content. They give direction regardless of what may be happening in the world. And this today is one of those conversations. I'm grateful to be able to talk to Jeremy Bundy. Jeremy is a filmmaker, is involved in various areas of marketing and content creation as well, but primarily a documentary filmmaker. He lives in Canada. He is a Christian. And so in 2020 and beyond, when Canada really shut down the country and listening to him talk. Here in the United States, we had lockdowns and those kind of things. But there it was very, very different. And he talks about that a little bit in this interview. But as a filmmaker and as a Christian, he stepped back during that process of time and decided that he was going to create a documentary about what was happening, about what did happen, about how churches, various churches on kind of the left, right, and center responded to what was happening. And it's an interesting story. It's a great story. But I think more than anything, we talk about this a little bit in the interview, it's something that will serve as a pattern, as an argument for future generations to know how to navigate whatever their issues are, and they're going to have them as well. The documentary is titled Antichrist and His Ruin, really interesting title that he talks about as well. I heard that and I thought, that's a really catchy right now title. And he says, no, this goes back to John Bunyan and the guy who wrote Pilgrim's Progress. This goes back a long way, and he talks about that. So great conversation, very helpful conversation, and really happy to be able to share this with you, with my guest, Jeremy Bundy. Jeremy, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it. Really looking forward to this conversation, so thanks for making time for us.
Yeah, thanks for having a pleb like me on.
Man, let's so there's like 4 places I want to start, but let's just start with your background. Talk about kind of where you grew up, how you grew up, and I don't love the phrase journey of faith, but how you came to faith and what the influences in your life were toward Christ.
Yeah, so I mean, I have probably what is the most powerful testimony you can have, and that is I grew up in a Christian family, and I'm a Christian.
Yeah, sure. And you still believe in Christ, yeah.
Yeah. No, I had godly parents who sought to raise me as best they could in the fear and admonition of the Lord, and I mean, I grew up in the with a Pentecostal background, so more of the charismatic background. But through working at one of the Harvest Bible churches, I began to stumble on kind of like a soft version of a Reformed faith, and began to just see God's sovereignty through pulling me towards Himself, and just His work in restraining the evil in my heart. I started off as touring with a few bands and playing some music. I love music, and then I kind of got into doing audio capture for a lot of commercial projects in Toronto, because I live about 2.5 hours just outside Toronto. And I really loved piecing these things together, and I really loved music, and I had every opportunity to sin.
Yeah.
And I just saw God's hand on me throughout my life, just restraining that evil in my heart and calling me towards Himself. So I really can't pin when I became a Christian, but over the last probably 6 to 8 years was when I really started seeing a Christian worldview form. And there's a vast difference between understanding the gospel in its simplistic form, but then developing a world and life view is what takes the power of that gospel and it delivers it to the culture. That's what a worldview does. And so I've really seen that really develop over the last few years. And then I really thank God that it was in a much more solid, structured state when the COVID lockdowns came, because then I was able to kind of hit the ground running and begin to fight right away. So that's my story in a nutshell.
We're going to talk about your documentary, Antichrist and His Ruin. Fascinating title, and I want to hear why the title and kind of what that encapsulates. But if we can talk about what happened in Canada or what was happening in Canada. You're a filmmaker. You're involved in a lot of other areas of film and communication and content production. But a filmmaker, so you're seeing what's happening in Canada, and I live in California, and I would argue that if there's anywhere in the United States that is similar in our political worldview to Canada, it's probably California. But even that, I think a lot of things happened in Canada. We saw some news clips and heard stories, and really getting a good perspective, a real maybe a clear view on what was happening, particularly in the Christian community, has been difficult. Kind of sum up. So you made a documentary about this. You talk about this. But what were the events that were taking place that led you to doing that? What was happening?
Well, I'm sure your listeners are well aware of the widespread COVID lockdowns in Canada and the U.S. That began in 2020. So I started sounding the alarm as we entered our first lockdown, and the government branded this lockdown 2 weeks to crush the curve.
Yeah, right.
And I immediately was saying it's not going to be this long. And lo and behold, it wasn't. It was much longer. So a lot of the churches originally took that 2 weeks and locked down just to kind of test out to see how serious this was, to see the truthfulness of the claims that the government was making. And as they began to really test the proof, to look into what these government agencies were peddling to us, a lot of these pastors began understanding that it wasn't as bad as they were saying. And not only that, they really began to grow in their understanding of Christ's authority and its ultimate nature, and the understanding that all earthly authority is a delegated authority, and that civil government has no business dictating the terms of worship for the church. And so this small group of pastors decided, it was time to open their doors. And because there's no such thing as neutrality in politics, if a government refuses to be in submission to King Jesus and his reign, it will by necessity view itself as the ultimate, right? So as these pastors began to take a stand and open their churches, the BC state came down pretty hard on them, and much harder than I think even California experienced in some places. But they started seizing buildings, fining and throwing pastors in jail, and the state basically went to take over its last crown jewel, which was Christ Church and Christ Bride.
One of the interesting things, in the United States, our Constitution is pretty clear on the freedom of religious expression. And so even in California, when churches, same thing, the first couple of weeks, we're going to do this for 2 weeks. And a lot of churches, just out of prudence or whatever, like, well, we don't want to kill people. We're not here for that. So let's go through this. And I fault no one for that. But on the other side of it, when churches started to go, it's not that bad. You have, people like MacArthur and so many other churches here, even in California, that were like, no, we're going back. Well, our Constitution protected that right. So the government made a lot of noise and said a lot of things, but couldn't seize property. They threatened to put people in jail, but they couldn't. They've lost every lawsuit because of our founding documents, where Canada is different in that regard. That right legally doesn't exist. And so it makes it a very different situation.
That's right. Yeah. Canada I mean, Joe Boot loves to make this this point that Canada is ultimately a social experiment, and so we don't have. You're right. We don't have founding documents that are as objective in nature as the Constitution. And the documentary actually goes over this, but there was a fundamental shift when Pierre Trudeau took over. He shifted us away from our founding documents that came from Anglo-Saxon culture and Britain. He shifted us away from that towards our own charter, and in that charter, there's a first clause that says, we can't infringe on the rights of the people unless it's demonstrably justified that we need to do so. Right?
Like a health crisis of some kind.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. And so we've seen, we've seen a lot of government overreach that hasn't just been in the last, 2 or 3 years. It's it extends much further back than that, and there was a fundamental shift away from our founding documents that find their objective nature and their objectiveness in Christ and His rule, towards a document that has holes in it large enough to take over your entire life.
I think one of the fascinating things as a Christian here in the United States was watching churches, and we have a culture that goes back generations where we have this common understanding of worship and church and God and these things. Just culturally, we accept that that's all a part of our lives. But then this crisis, right, this man-made or whatever crisis comes into play. And for the first time, at least in my lifetime, it became evident without dispute which churches really were committed to biblical truth and biblical understanding and which were more cultural in nature. You couldn't see it when things were fine, when everything was going along and people were moving along and we had a common belief in what was right and what was wrong. But when all of that was stripped away, boy, it became clear. And it seems like Canada was that, exponentially, understanding which churches really held on to the truth of the Bible and which ones were more cultural or more, state religious institutions instead of local churches.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, you see that in the Pharisees too, right? Their desire for status and their desire to have their comforts, have their elite status, have that kind of cultural leadership ability, without getting too close to having to live faithfully for the Savior.
Yeah, that's right.
And I mean, that's one good thing that COVID has done, and the government has done, is help weed out the unfaithful churches, and I mean, we've seen what I would consider as revival in Canadian churches, and the ones that have stayed open, just explosion of numbers. And it's not just numbers, but so many different testimonies of God working through the people because they went to a church that stayed open.
What impact have those churches had on maybe the unchurched? I know Canada's a big place, but in your observation, people who maybe had no religious affiliation, they weren't churched people, but watching this happen, what impact has that had on those folks?
Yeah, we go really into depth about that in the documentary, but some of my favorite interviews had stories of people that had shown up to church saying, I came for protest, but I left with worship.
Wow.
These are unchurched folk who, another story is of a group of people that showed up at a church and specifically said that they were there because, quote unquote, you guys were the only ones that were standing up against these tyrannies, right? The abuses of the government. You were the only ones that stood in the gap for us, and that's why they went to church. And so there are tons of powerful testimonies of what the Lord has done to the unchurched community through this trial, right?
That's good. So let's talk specifically about the documentary, Antichrist and His Ruin. So maybe start us off with why that title. That's a fascinating title, Antichrist and His Ruin, and then map it out for us. What led to this, and kind of how do you tell the story in the documentary?
I'm going to have to go back in time
Sure.
to explain the title.
Sure.
So I'm going to do my best to give you just a brief history overview of where the title came from. So in short, it's a title of a John Bunyan book, and it was written towards the end of John Bunyan's life. So during that time, the tyrant King James II took the throne roughly 3 years before John Bunyan's death, and James conspired to consolidate and centralize his power. So that, I'm sure that sounds quite familiar.
Sure. I've heard this
story.
He
knew that, he knew that Bunyan was a threat to that because Bunyan had been imprisoned as a dissenter before. And so he actually tried to pacify Bunyan with political favors. And Bunyan, who was coming towards the end of his life, had every reason to take the bribe and live his last few years of his life comfortably. But thankfully, he didn't do that. And Bunyan doubled down and wrote the book of Antichrist and His Ruin, which warned of the Antichrist's rise and rule and gave hope to those living under his reign. So there's a lot of parallel storytelling in the film. We are quoting from John Bunyan's book of Antichrist and His Ruin throughout the film, but we're also relating those quotes back to what we are seeing today in some of the government tyrannies in the West.
So Antichrist, talk about what you mean by Antichrist, or what is meant by Antichrist then. You don't have to go too far back, but when someone hears that, so when I hear that, I think, kind of apocalyptic, and I think very Book of Revelation, and I'm sure that connotation is present there, of course, but I would imagine it has a more specific meaning to you as it relates to, the last couple of years.
Yeah. Well, John says many antichrists have come.
Right.
And many antichrists are going to come. So Bunyan viewed the Antichrist as anybody who would usurp the ultimate authority of Christ.
Yeah, that's good.
And so we one of the things that the documentary does is it lays out a very robust theology of Antichrist, and it might not be something that a very dispensational culture might be used to. I don't know, man. You're gonna have to edit this out, but
no, it's good.
I'm not like necessarily a pastor or theologian. I mean, I laid it out in the doc, and I edited it together, but it was all these very scholarly people, explaining it. But historically, the reformers viewed Antichrist as the Pope because he was usurping the authority of Christ. Yeah. We viewed Justin Trudeau as the Antichrist, and Joe Biden, anybody who usurps the authority of Christ.
Yeah.
And we lay that argument out very clearly in the documentary.
And I think this is one of the problems for Christians, or one of the challenges for Christians right now, is that we don't understand the world around us from a biblical perspective, certainly, but using biblical terms. We think about the Antichrist, and this is end times, and wherever you fall in your eschatology, you have a specific understanding of that. But to think about the Antichrists, right, those who are opposed, as you mentioned, to the authority of Christ, when we start to view what's happening in our world as in line with Christ or opposed to Christ, to the worship of God or the worship of man, when we start to really parse it that way, it changes not only how we see the world, but how we respond to it. And I think of so much of what's happening related to gender and the trans ideology stuff and all this stuff that's happening. Why is the church so confused about it? Well, because we don't view things biblically. We don't understand that you can be for God or against him. There's not a middle area where it's like, well, no, it's going to be fine. It's not going to be fine. There's a right way and a wrong way. There are those who worship God and live for him, and those who are against him or opposed to him. There's not another way. And so to me, that's very important. Just what do we mean by that, right? Well, we mean those who are opposed to Christ's authority. And that's right. Man, what a great way to look at it, and a good starting point.
Yeah.
So as you tell this story, you bring in, a lot of experts, I don't love the word expert, right? Because what makes someone an expert?
Yeah.
We put expert underneath their name.
Yeah, Fauci.
But a lot of theologians, a lot of folks who spend time thinking about this. Who are some of the people that came on, and maybe some of the highlights for you as a filmmaker?
Yeah, I mean, we so every pastor that had skin in the game, or most pastors that had skin in the game, meaning that they were either fined, imprisoned, or their building was seized, was invited to be in the documentary. So I think there's something like almost 20 different people.
Wow.
In the documentary, and we did reach out to the quote unquote experts. So we reached out to, Tim Stevens, arresting officer. We reached out to Premier Doug Ford, who your listeners probably won't know, but he's a government leader who is going after Trinity Bible Chapel. You guys can look up their story, but hundreds of millions of dollars of fines, right? We invited the experts on, but didn't get a response. So
shocking.
Shocking. Yeah. Really surprised, but it's a powerful film just because it's got so many parallel storytelling elements to it. So it's not just oh, poor us, we were persecuted for righteousness' sake. Look at us. But it's really the story of courage begetting courage, right?
Yeah.
As the faithful few took a stand, the people who were kind of hiding in the background saw that and then began to open their churches, and it was kind of this snowball effect. And so the coolest element to me is just how that courage begetting courage, and hearing the stories of one pastor referencing another pastor who's a completely different denomination and doesn't have the exact same beliefs, but is unified with Christ's lordship. Talk about him hearing a sermon that he preached from a couple months ago, and him deciding to open his church, and then that trickle effect down the line to other people. It was a really awesome testimony to what happens when you take a faithful stand and you're courageous for the Lord, and that's exactly what the government did not want to see.
Right.
And so what believers have to understand is, even if it's just a few people faithfully standing for the Lord, you never know how widespread that impact, how far that's going to reach, and that was kind of the underpinning story of the doc too. Was we're not just looking into this story of John Bunyan and relating 16th century, some of the plights and fights of the 16th century Puritans to modern day, but we're also telling the story of how courage and faithfulness inspired courage and faithfulness in other believers and other pastors.
I know one of the things that was important to you about this was not just telling the stories, but telling them in a creative way. And I don't know if you would use the word artistic way, but a way that makes it watchable as well as telling an incredible story. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because I think that's where a lot of Christian filmmakers miss it, right? Like, we got these incredible stories, and they're amazing stories, and we tell them so poorly that people don't get out of it what they should.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, a big inspiration for me is Anglo-Saxon culture, and the poet who would entertain in the King's Mead Hall was called the Shope. And he was the shaper or creator, and these poets were known as the closest thing to God himself, which was a shaper of all history. And the poet actually imitated the divine as he sang and entertained about God's work throughout history. And it was the Shope that captured the attention of Alfred the Great and was one of his major inspirations throughout his life and his reign. And so I say that because the left has shown that they don't really care about facts or history, and what God has been doing throughout history and the story that God has been knitting together throughout history. And so, you start to wonder how some of these educational institutions can brainwash people into some of these absurdities, right? But it's in part because they have mastered sinful storytelling that the base mind loves. It's storytelling without the element of God's work throughout history. It's storytelling without truth. And so as Christians, we've largely abandoned the arts as well. And so specifically the art of storytelling is widely been lost amongst Christian artists, and while we've abandoned that, the left has spent their time mastering the sinful version of it.
Yeah.
And so my goal with anything that I film or shoot is to make it as engaging and persuasive as possible, and basically to tell the best story I can, to bring people along on a journey. But in order to do that, every single element has to work together. So, I don't just want to care about the brute facts, although those are very important. I want to care about, the narrative, the visuals, the audio, the music, everything. How does all of this work together? You not only have to think through and ask the question, like, how do I cut this story together, but what music helps convey the mood?
Yeah.
What lighting should I go with that will help tell the story? Where are we filming the interviews? What should the set look like? One of the coolest hidden gems in the film is how every location tells the personal story of the subject, yet adds to the complete film narrative from beginning to end. So Steve, a pastor named Steve, was excommunicated from his presbytery.
Wow.
And had to pick up a manual labor job in order to provide for his family. So where did we shoot his interview? We shot it with a stack of drywall in the corner, and in an unfinished factory that was under construction. And so that, those elements all work together for a very cinematic storytelling feel.
Yeah.
And if you're going to produce a 2.5 hour documentary film, you better be good at telling stories, and you better be good at telling cinematic stories, or having all these elements work together for a beautiful end product. There's a reason why the world can sit through a 3-hour Batman movie,
right?
Right, and it's a fake story. It's not a story about God's reality. So we should be. As Christians, we should be trying to shape this art of storytelling. And actually, it's really interesting too, because when Christians care about all of these elements going into beautiful storytelling, we become interesting to a culture that has no standard of beauty.
That's
right?
Interesting.
So we think about Rembrandt, the 16th century Dutch Reformational painter, largely considered, the best visual artist ever. And what sort of lighting did we do in the film? We went with Rembrandt lighting, because, when you're working at your craft, and you have that standard of beauty in your worldview, the pagans will take notice, and the pagans still teach and give YouTube tutorials on Rembrandt lighting today. They have no idea that he was a Reformational painter.
Yeah.
But if you search Rembrandt lighting, you'll have video after video after video of teaching you how to Rembrandt light. And so, just as Christians, it's really not enough to just master one element of storytelling. It's whenever I shoot something, I'm obsessive over the details. I want everything to work together to glorify God, and tell a really beautiful story as best as I can do.
So you create a beautiful documentary, and someone who's interested in, as you just described and walked through, art and beauty, they like the style, they like what you've done, but they're coming with no baseline understanding of God or Christianity. They're watching it because of what it looks like. They're watching it because of the way you've created it. They like stories, not necessarily this story, but stories. What would that person walk away with? A person who's not a Christian, they come into this because of the art form. What would they walk away with on the other side?
Well, the film is 2 hours. It's 2.5 hours.
Yeah. So other than walking away tired, what would they?
Yeah. It's hard because I haven't necessarily heard any testimony of non-Christians watching it. It's mainly been Christians that have reached out to me, just giving me their testimonial about how it helped them repent and created a robust view of Christ's authority. So I'm not sure how to answer that, man.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. Well, it's a testimony of God's goodness. I imagine that, in contrast to what they would see in the world around them, perhaps that's the story.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
What was your goal going into it, on the other side of it? So for the community you were writing this and creating this for, what were you hoping that maybe the Christian community would gain from your story?
The Christian community faced a lot of pushback in Canada. The amount of pastors that sought to live faithfully for the lordship of Christ were very few, and so I wanted to obviously bring widespread awareness to their stories and
Yeah.
the stories of persecution that they faced. But then I also wanted to give a robust, irrefutable line of argument that caused people who had closed their churches, that caused pastors who had closed their churches to have no other wiggle room.
Yep.
I wanted them to either admit that they had to open their churches to be faithful, or they had to cower away and they were guilty of being a coward. So I wanted to create a robust enough argument that it pushed them one of either way. And I guess it was the same for their congregants too. Ultimately, I just wanted to build a robust enough argument that it forced them to take action.
That's good. I personally believe that, whether it's in written form, a book, or a documentary like this, they're so important not only to tell the stories of the people who lived through them, but to serve as a guide for future generations of people. You're probably familiar with the author Eric Metaxas. He's written several books, but he wrote a book on Bonhoeffer, and I read that book, and it changed really for me how I looked at the world, and it was so impactful for me personally just to hear that story. And then as we came into the events of 2020 and on, the lines between what was happening and what happened then became clear. And then Metaxas wrote his book, Letters to the American Church, where that's exactly what he does, is he says, this is what's happening now. This is what happened then. We've seen this story before. We know how it's going to end, right? And if people aren't doing what you're doing, then when this happens again, and it will, I mean, some would argue that it's continuing, right? Maybe without the COVID component, but the rest of it continues. They won't have a guide necessarily to know how to navigate that, and you've provided that, and that's invaluable. I think of my kids all the time. I've got 2 young adult kids, and then 2 teenagers, and I think about the world they're going to grow up in, and a lot of the content that I produce, honestly, I hope other people benefit from it, but I want my kids to have something to go back to and go, okay, yeah, Dad thought about this, or other people have thought about this at a different time, and that's what they did, and this is what they were wishing they had done earlier, and so they can use it as a guide. And I think, man, what you've done is you've really laid out not just the case for the people who lived through it and may have responded rightly or wrongly, but for those generations of people who are coming up behind us that are going to want to do the right thing, and they just need someone to tell them how. Man, thanks for doing it. These are the kind of legacy projects, right? That are going to impact people long after you're gone. And
yeah, man, that's a good
thought. I think
it's awesome. It's hard as a Christian artist because everything is so viral, right? There's, I'm pretty sure last month there were at least 8 other documentaries, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So I mean, it's an awesome thought, and very encouraging. Thanks for that.
Well, what makes Christians different is if we're going to the Bible and saying, how does the Bible apply to this situation that we're living through? Well, that doesn't change. So the situation may change, the circumstance may change, whatever, but the biblical truth applied doesn't change. And man, that's incredible. Where can people get the documentary and watch it and then share it? And then beyond that, just follow the other work that you do.
So antichristdocumentary.com is where you can watch it, and you can buy the soundtrack there too. There was a song that we especially produced for the project. So there's a few other things in the shop, but everything can be found there. There's both a physical DVD and a streaming option available, and you can stream to any device. So we built that custom platform out to best serve the Christian community and make sure that we wouldn't be able to be canceled.
Yeah, right.
And then as far as my other projects, I'm still a little burnt out from the scope of work on this one. So I'm in a phase of rest right now.
That's good.
But people can follow me on social media, and I'm not that exciting, so follow at your own risk.
Follow at your own risk. That's awesome. Jeremy Bundy, thanks, man. I really appreciate it. Thanks for the work you do, and thanks for the conversation. It's awesome.
Thanks for having me on.
We were not made to live in isolation. Sadly, many of our veterans feel they need to fight their battles alone. This self-isolation has led to the staggering statistic of more than 20 veterans taking their lives every day.
A lot of guys end up drinking, a lot of guys end up losing hope. Some of them will go to the VA and they'll try to get, prescription medications to help with PTSD. They'll get pills for anxiety, they'll get pills because they can't sleep, now they'll get pills for depression. Before they know it, they're taking 12 different medications. And when it's not working out, these guys lose hope, and that's why there's 23 guys a day committing suicide.
The mission of Mighty Oaks is to eradicate the veteran suicide epidemic and help our warriors change their legacies. As a result, we've been able to help over 4,000 veterans and first responders by equipping them with the tools they need to live the lives they were created to live.
Everything they said just kept hitting me in the heart over and over and over again. It's like all the things that I didn't know that I needed to hear. And I opened my heart to God that week, dude, and I've been a different person ever since.
Our faith-based, peer-to-peer approach has one of the highest success rates of any program available today, offering hope and understanding to those who need it most. We provide our programs and resources, including travel, at no cost to our warriors.
I remember talking to a licensed social worker who actually handed me a pamphlet to Mighty Oaks. So I went, and I'm glad I did.
By aligning their lives to biblical principles, these men and women are able to lead their families, their communities, and our nation. Our mission is to serve and restore our nation's warriors and families who have endured hardship through their service to America, and to help them find new life purpose through hope in Christ. It's your generosity that can make a difference in the lives of the men and women who have fought for our country and our freedoms. Now that they're home, don't let them fight alone. Learn more at mightyoaksprograms.org. Just when you thought it couldn't get any better, Mike Lindell with MyPillow is launching the MyPillow 2.0. When Mike invented MyPillow, it had everything you could ever want in a pillow. Now, nearly 20 years later, he discovered a new technology that makes it even better. The MyPillow 2.0 has the patented adjustable fill of the original MyPillow, and now with a brand new fabric that is made with a temperature regulating thread. The MyPillow 2.0 is the softest, smoothest, and coolest pillow you'll ever own. For our exclusive listeners, the MyPillow 2.0 is buy one, get one free offer with promo code SITREP. MyPillow 2.0 temperature regulating technology is 100% made in the USA and comes with a 10-year warranty and a 60-day money-back guarantee. Just go to MyPillow.com and click on the radio listener square to buy the one, get one free offer. Enter promo code SITREP or call 800-870-0283 to get your MyPillow 2.0 now. Fantastic conversation. I would encourage you go and find the documentary Antichrist and His Ruin. Antichrist documentary is the website. You can go and find that. Check it out. Again, this is an interesting story, well told. But beyond that, I think there's so many lessons that are outlined in this that can be a help to us. What we know about culture is that it is ever changing. That's why I talk about it. That aspect of culture every episode. It's always changing, but as the saying goes, the more things change, the more they stay the same. It's going to look different in the future, but it's not going to look that much different. These unprecedented times we're living through are not that unprecedented. People who have gone before us have lived through similar situations. They figured it out. We've lived through something crazy. Others in the future will live through their own crazy thing. Hopefully, we've learned some lessons we can teach them. And documentaries like this one go a long way to doing that. So very grateful for Jeremy and his time today. If you are not yet subscribed to the show, please take some time to do that. Would love to have you subscribe, share this content out with others. That would be very helpful to us and allow us to produce additional content. take some time to go to our website, thesitrep.org, and you can find an archive, opportunity to sign up for our newsletter, other great content there as well. And we love to share that with you. Again, thank you for joining us. Look forward to talking to you next time.